The first time anyone realized something was terribly wrong was long before the screaming began. It started with a single still image, grainy, overexposed, and trembling with digital noise, pulled from the final seconds of a CCTV recording. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a young woman walking home, head bowed against the cool night air, her shadow stretching thin beneath the flickering streetlight. But the longer the detectives stared, the more wrongness bled through the frame. There was something in the darkness behind her, something that didn't belong to the street, the night, or anything they had a name for. A shape too tall, too narrow, standing exactly where the light refused to fall. And then, in the very next frame, she was gone. The officers who responded that night tried to rationalize it. Glitch. Compression artifact. Technical interference. Anything but the dread rising in their chests. They canvassed the block, knocked on doors, searched alleys, and swept the nearby woods, but every trail led back to the same impossible point. The last place she'd been seen was a patch of darkness no bigger than a doorway, as if the night itself had opened and swallowed her whole. Her home offered even stranger clues. Every clock frozen at the same minute, the second hands suspended in mid-tick, as though time had been paused and forgotten. Neighbors whispered about a single sound they'd heard just before dawn, a sharp, tearing scream that ended as abruptly as it began. But when officers checked audio monitors and security feeds around the neighborhood, nothing had recorded it. The air itself had been silent. Detectives widened the search, and that was when the deeper horror emerged. The case wasn't new. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't even rare. For decades, names and faces had slipped through the cracks under nearly identical circumstances, missing persons with no suspects, no evidence, and the same smear of corruption in the footage, like the camera had tried to capture something it wasn't built to understand. The deeper they looked, the more the case seemed to twist, shifting under their hands, as if resisting the very act of being solved. By the time one of their own vanished, they no longer pretended they were dealing with something human. The bodycam recording cut out mid-sentence, but not before capturing a whisper he wasn't supposed to hear, a voice calling his name from inside a darkness that had no depth and no bottom. Even now, the officers assigned to the investigation refuse to discuss certain parts of it. They say the case files change on their own. They say the evidence rearranges itself. They say some nights, just before the station lights flicker, they hear someone breathing at the edge of the room. And none of them, not a single one, will ever watch that final CCTV frame alone. The first disappearance began so quietly that, at first, no one understood what they were looking at. The young woman in the footage was simply walking home along a familiar route she had taken countless times, a path lit by a row of dull street lamps humming with tired electricity. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or urgency. She wasn't running, checking behind her, or behaving like someone being followed. It was an ordinary night, a short walk, a safe neighborhood. That was what made her vanishing so profoundly unsettling. Her every step was crisp and clear in the footage, her shoes tapping lightly against the pavement, the swing of her arms steady, the faint breeze catching her hair. And then she moved toward a dim patch of darkness cast by a malfunctioning streetlight. The moment she crossed its threshold, the camera distorted. Lines of static jittered across the frame, bending the shape of her body, stretching her shadow unnaturally long. For a fraction of a second, the entire screen brightened as if struck by an invisible pulse. And when the image stabilized again, she was gone. The officers replayed the footage again and again, hoping they had missed something, a movement, a blur, a silhouette. But the moment always played the same way. 1 second she existed, and the next she didn't. There was no sign of anyone else nearby, no vehicle pulling up, no possible hiding place she could have slipped behind. The patch of darkness she stepped into was shallow, barely large enough to conceal her knees. Even if someone had grabbed her, the lack of struggle made no sense. There was no flinch, no jerk of her arm, no widening of her eyes. She simply vanished as though she had walked through an invisible doorway no one else could see. Residents who lived on that street insisted they heard nothing unusual. No shout, no footsteps, no scuffle. The air had been still, the night uneventful. A delivery driver passing through at the time later told police he remembered glancing down the road and seeing the street lamps flicker all at once, a synchronized stutter of light that lasted no more than a heartbeat. At the time, he dismissed it as faulty wiring, but when the investigation began, the detail unsettled him. Every attempt to enhance the video only worsened the mystery. The clearer the image became, the stranger it looked. The shape of the darkness itself seemed to shift slightly in each frame, as if something within it was moving, responding, waiting for her to step just a little closer before it reached out and took everything in its path, leaving behind only an empty strip of cold pavement where she should have stood. When detectives attempted to enhance the CCTV footage, they expected the usual kinds of artifacts: blurred pixels, stretched shadows, or patterns caused by low light. What they didn't expect was a shape that should not have been there, appearing in exactly one frame, a frame so brief that most viewers would never notice it without pausing at the precise millisecond. When the image was isolated, the outline became disturbingly clear. Behind the young woman, in a spot that moments earlier had been empty darkness, stood a tall, elongated silhouette. Its proportions were subtly wrong. The limbs appeared too long for any ordinary person, the torso unnaturally narrow, the head tilted at such an angle that the detectives felt a quiet discomfort simply studying it. The figure had no defining facial features, no visible clothing, and yet its presence felt intentional, as though it had positioned itself directly behind her, waiting for her to step into the shadowed area where the streetlight failed to reach. Technicians ran the frame through multiple enhancement programs, adjusting contrast, exposure, and infrared overlays, but the more they clarified the image, the more unsettling it became. Instead of revealing details, the enhancements made the figure appear even less human. Edges blurred in ways that defied natural motion, as if the figure wasn't bound by normal physical rules. In some enhancements, the outline faintly quivered, suggesting movement too fast or too subtle for the camera to capture. In others, the figure's limbs seemed slightly displaced, as though they didn't align with the rest of its form. One technician reported seeing faint impressions of additional arms or extensions, though no one else could confirm it, and he later refused to review the footage again. What disturbed investigators most was the timing. The figure appeared only in the single frame before the woman vanished, never before, never after. There was no approach visible, no exit path, no transitions. It manifested behind her as if triggered by her presence, as though the shadow itself had condensed into a shape only long enough to claim her. Experts who examined the frame insisted no human could have entered the scene without being caught in the preceding seconds of footage. The camera angle covered the entire street. Anything approaching would have been visible long before it stood directly behind her. Yet the frame resolutely contradicted every logical explanation. Some officers tried to dismiss it as a visual trick, a distortion created by low resolution and failing streetlights. But others felt something deeper, an instinctive warning that this figure wasn't an illusion at all. Its posture seemed predatory, its stillness deliberate. The longer they stared at the single frame, the more they sensed that whatever stood there had been aware of the camera, aware of the woman, and aware that its appearance needed only an instant to change the course of a life forever. When officers entered the missing woman's home, they expected the usual signs of a hurried departure or a struggle: cluttered rooms, misplaced objects, something broken or overturned. Instead, they stepped into a silence so complete that it felt unnatural, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. The air was cold despite the heater being set to run, and a faint metallic scent lingered in the living room, something no one could immediately place. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly normal. The sofa cushions were undisturbed, the remote lay neatly on the coffee table, and a mug half full sat on the kitchen counter as though she had stepped away for only a moment. It was only when one officer checked the time on a wall clock that the first unsettling detail emerged. The clock had stopped at 3:17 a.m. Curious, he checked another clock in the kitchen, also frozen at 3:17. This prompted the officers to search the entire house more deliberately, and soon they realized that every single timekeeping device in the home, whether electric, battery-powered, or analog, had stopped at the exact same minute. The microwave display showed 3:17. The bedside alarm clock displayed 3:17. Even a cheap wristwatch left on her dresser had its hands locked in place, as though time had ceased simultaneously across every device she owned. None of the clocks showed signs of malfunction, batteries were new, cables were secure, and there was no indication of a power surge or outage in the neighborhood. It was as if the moment she vanished had radiated backward into her home, freezing time the instant it happened. Neighbors later reported waking around that same hour to a short, piercing scream that lasted no more than a second. It came from the direction of her house, sharp enough to jolt them from sleep but ending too quickly for anyone to be certain of what they had heard. Some dismissed it as a nightmare or the cry of an animal, but others insisted it sounded human, though unnervingly distorted. When police checked the audio logs from nearby security systems, they found nothing. Microphones that should have picked up any unusual sound recorded only silence, an uninterrupted void that made the neighbors' testimony even stranger. As the investigation continued, forensic teams searched the house for electrical or magnetic irregularities that could explain the synchronized stoppage, but the readings came back normal. There were no signs of tampering, no evidence of someone entering the home to manipulate the clocks, and no environmental phenomena that could account for such a precise disruption. Yet the frozen time hovered over the investigation like a quiet accusation, a moment preserved not by malfunction but by intent. Everything in the house seemed to point toward 3:17 a.m. as the moment something had reached into her world, halted its rhythm, and erased her path forward as if she had never existed beyond that second. As detectives widened their investigation beyond the woman's disappearance, a pattern began to surface, one subtle enough to have gone unnoticed for decades, yet chillingly precise once all the pieces were laid out together. It started when an older officer, long retired, contacted the department after hearing rumors about the strange CCTV frame. He claimed the case reminded him of something from years ago, a missing person who had also vanished in a poorly lit space without any sign of struggle. Intrigued, the lead detective requested the old case file. The similarities were undeniable. That victim, too, had taken a short walk home, step by ordinary step, before entering a pocket of darkness where cameras lost track of her, only to reappear empty and undisturbed. No suspect had ever been found. The file had gathered dust ever since. Once that connection was made, other cases began emerging, some forgotten, others cold, all eerie in their resemblance. A teenager in 1992 who disappeared under a flickering underpass. A postal worker in 2001 last seen walking behind his building into a shadowed loading zone. A jogger in 2010 who vanished while crossing beneath a dim streetlight whose bulb had inexplicably burned out mere minutes earlier. All of them captured on camera moments before they vanished. All of them moving into an area where the darkness seemed too deep, too heavy, almost as if it were swallowing the light around it. Every scene carried that same impossible signature. No sudden movement, no abduction, no evidence left behind, not even a footprint out of place. Just a person, alive and present one moment, and then gone as though erased from existence. The investigators created a timeline and were struck by the strange intervals between the incidents. They did not occur in predictable cycles, but the gaps seemed neither random nor accidental. Each disappearance happened in a different town, a different neighborhood, always spaced out just far enough to avoid suspicion, yet close enough to form a chilling thread when mapped together. When they plotted the locations, an unsettling pattern emerged. Each point was connected by routes with minimal artificial lighting, areas where shadows pooled naturally, places where nights lingered longer and darker than they should. The detectives began interviewing families of the older victims, reopening wounds long thought closed. Some recalled hearing strange electrical hums the night their loved ones vanished. Others remembered their pets behaving erratically at certain hours. All of them, without exception, mentioned a sense of being watched during the days leading up to the disappearance. These whispers, scattered across decades, began to paint a picture that felt less like coincidence and more like a presence moving through time with deliberate patience. It never struck twice in the same place, never lingered long enough to be caught, yet always followed the same ritual: wait for darkness, find the moment when someone slipped into its grasp, and take them without leaving behind a single clue the living could understand. The search of the surrounding woods began as a routine sweep, the kind officers had performed countless times in missing person investigations, but almost immediately they sensed that something about this place resisted them. The entrance to the forest looked ordinary enough, tall trees crowding together, thick undergrowth curling around their roots, but the moment the team stepped beneath the canopy, the outside world seemed to fall away. The air grew dense, muffled, as if the branches overhead were absorbing sound rather than letting it pass. Footsteps that should have crunched loudly against dry leaves were strangely hushed, reduced to soft, padded thuds. Even their breathing felt quieter, swallowed by the heavy stillness that clung to everything. Within minutes, their radios began to fail. First, the signals crackled, then distorted, and finally went silent altogether. Attempts to reconnect were met only with static that seemed too rhythmic to be random, almost like breathing or a faint whispering beneath the interference. One officer suggested atmospheric interference, but the more experienced members of the team exchanged uneasy glances. Radios didn't fail like this in these woods. They never had before. And the deeper they moved, the more the forest felt wrong. The trees leaned subtly inward, their trunks bending in ways that seemed to shift when no one was looking. Pockets of shadow pooled unnaturally on the ground, darker than the surrounding foliage despite the uniform shade overhead. It was during the third sweep that the strangest incident occurred. Officer Ramirez, walking near the rear of the group, abruptly froze. His partner turned to find him standing rigid, eyes wide, staring into a patch of darkness between two trees. When asked what he saw, Ramirez didn't answer at first, only raised a shaking hand to point. His partner stepped closer, squinting into the shadows, but there was nothing, no animal, no movement, just an ordinary gap between trunks. Ramirez insisted he had felt someone behind him moments earlier, leaning close enough that a cold exhale brushed the back of his neck. He had spun around expecting to see one of the team, but instead found himself staring into a hollow darkness that seemed deeper than it had any right to be. He grew pale as he described the sensation, insisting it hadn't been imagination or wind but something intentional, deliberate, as if a presence had drawn close enough to inspect him. Shortly after, he collapsed without warning, his pulse racing and his skin clammy as though he had been standing in sub-zero temperatures. Medics rushed to him, baffled by the sudden drop in his body temperature. Once revived, he refused to continue the sweep, insisting that something in the woods was watching them all with patient interest. The team finished their search but found no trace of the missing woman or any evidence that anyone had entered the forest at all. And yet, as they exited the tree line, each officer felt an unmistakable sensation trailing behind them, like unseen eyes following their retreat, lingering at the border of the trees as if disappointed that none of them had wandered just a little deeper into the waiting dark. The appearance of the survivor should have brought relief, but instead it deepened the sense that the case had crossed into territory no one on the force was prepared to understand. He was found wandering near the edge of a remote field miles from town, barefoot and trembling, his eyes unfocused as though staring at something far beyond the horizon. At first glance, he looked like a frail old man, his hair thin and white, his skin marked with deep creases, and his back hunched as if weighed down by time itself. But when he whispered his name to the paramedics, one of them froze. They recognized him. He was the missing hiker who had vanished 3 days earlier, a healthy man in his 30s with no medical conditions. Yet the man before them seemed to have aged at least 4 decades in the span of 72 hours. As they brought him in for evaluation, the doctors found his symptoms impossible to categorize. His vital signs were unstable, fluctuating wildly between readings. His skin temperature ran cold enough to suggest exposure, yet he had no frostbite. His muscles showed signs of atrophy more consistent with someone bedridden for years, not days. When questioned, he struggled to speak at first, each sentence clipped short as if the memory caused pain. But gradually, fragments of his story began to surface. He insisted he had not been gone for 3 days. To him, only a handful of hours had passed. He remembered walking through the woods near dusk when everything around him seemed to shift. He described the trees bending unnaturally, the shadows thickening, the air torn by a humming vibration he felt more through his bones than his ears. He turned to head back toward the trail, but found the path behind him swallowed by a darkness that seemed alive, pulsing faintly like the surface of deep water. Somewhere within that thickened dark, he sensed movement. Not the rustling of an animal or the snap of a branch, but something slow and deliberate, something that watched him with an attention so sharp it felt like pressure against his skull. He claimed he tried to run, but the forest around him stretched in ways that made no sense. Distances warped. Landmarks dissolved. With each step, he felt the ground pulling him downward, the shadows closing in until he couldn't tell where the forest ended and something else began. The next thing he remembered was waking in a place where there was no light, no sound, only a cold presence drifting around him like a slow tide. He couldn't see it, couldn't touch it, but he felt its shape brushing against his thoughts, searching for something within him. When he was found, his final words before sedation were a whisper that chilled the room. "It let me go because it didn't want me. It's still looking for the one it does." The forensic artist assigned to the case approached her work with the same calm, methodical precision she had honed over years of reconstructing faces from vague or broken descriptions. She had dealt with unreliable witnesses, traumatized survivors, and individuals whose memories fractured under fear, but nothing prepared her for the man found in the field. His recounting of the figure he had seen, felt, more than seen, was fragmented, shifting each time he tried to explain it. Still, she was accustomed to pulling clarity from chaos. She guided him gently, sketching the contours he described, adjusting lines based on his hesitant affirmations. By the time she finished the initial draft, the survivor had fallen silent, staring at the sketch with an expression of dread that rooted her to the spot. The figure on the page was impossibly tall and narrow, its limbs elongated and its posture bent in a way that suggested both stillness and movement at once. The face was the most unsettling part, not because it was monstrous, but because it was almost featureless, just the faintest suggestion of eyes set too deeply and too far apart. At first, she dismissed the survivor's reaction as trauma. Many witnesses became emotional when confronted with a visual version of their fear. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the sketch was different. It felt heavy somehow, as if the lines on the page carried more weight than graphite should. She set it aside, planning to finalize it the next morning. That night, she left the office with an inexplicable tension in her chest, an instinctive sense that the strange case was beginning to draw her in. The next day, when she returned to her workspace, she noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The eyes in the sketch looked slightly different. They seemed a touch wider, a fraction darker, as though someone had deepened the shading while she was away. She checked her pencils, her erasers, the debris on her desk. Nothing indicated the drawing had been altered. She brushed it off as exhaustion, telling herself she must have remembered the eyes wrong. But over the next few days, the changes became more obvious. At times, she could swear the figure's head tilted a millimeter lower, its posture shifted just enough to feel more alert, more aware. The shadows beneath the faint eye shapes seemed to deepen, forming hollows that hadn't been there before. She tested her memory by photographing the sketch, then comparing it to the physical page hours later. The differences were minute but undeniable. The tilt of the head, the curve of the arms, the shape of the darkness around the figure. None of her colleagues believed her at first, until one evening she called the lead detective in a trembling voice, asking him to come immediately. When he arrived, she pointed silently to the sketch on her desk. The eyes, once vague impressions, were now distinctly defined, staring straight out of the page with an intelligence that made both of them step back. She insisted she had not touched the drawing. And in the silence that followed, she asked the question neither wanted to answer. If she hadn't drawn those eyes, then who or what had been looking back at them, waiting for someone to notice the change? The night the missing woman's phone suddenly powered on was the first moment the case shifted from eerie to terrifying. Her family had kept the device in a drawer since the investigation began, hoping it might someday hold a clue the police had overlooked. The battery had been long dead, confirmed by both detectives and technicians. It had shown no signs of life for weeks. Yet at 2:59 a.m., without being touched, without being charged, the screen lit up on its own, casting an unnatural glow across the room. Her sister, jolted awake by the sudden vibration, approached the drawer with trembling hands. The phone was warm, too warm, as if something inside it had been active for hours. Before she could unlock it, the device buzzed again, sending a single message to her number as though the missing woman herself had typed it. There were no words. Just an image. When she opened the message, her breath caught in her throat. The photo was blurred, but clearly taken in a place no one recognized, a narrow hallway with walls that seemed to stretch unnaturally far, lit by a dim, colorless glow that didn't resemble any real light source. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, impossibly tall, its head brushing the low ceiling, its elongated body turned directly toward the camera. Even in the blurry resolution, Its posture radiated intent. The figure had no distinct face, yet it gave the overwhelming impression of staring, watching, waiting. The angle of the photo made it even more unsettling. It was as if the camera had been lifted by an unsteady hand, pointed forward in fear, and snapped at the exact moment the entity noticed. Her sister dropped the phone and screamed for help. Detectives rushed to her house within minutes, bracing themselves for a simple malfunction or a hoax. But when they examined the phone, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The battery level read 98%, fully charged despite weeks of inactivity. The message had no metadata, no timestamp, no geolocation, nothing. It did not appear on the phone bill. It acted as though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Technicians attempted to trace the source, only to find the phone's internal logs corrupted by a type of static they couldn't explain. Even stranger, the hallway in the photo had no discernible depth. When they enhanced the image, the walls looked as though they bent inward and outward simultaneously, the perspective warping in ways that defied geometry. The figure's outline blurred into the surrounding darkness, giving the impression that it was both standing in the hall and emerging from it at the same time. What shook the detectives most wasn't the impossibility of the photo or the spontaneous activation of the phone. It was the survivor's shaky voice when he saw the image hours later. He pointed a trembling finger at the figure and whispered that this was the same presence he had felt in the lightless place where he had been taken. But what terrified him more was the hallway. He said he had never seen it before, but he was certain he knew what it meant. The thing that took the woman wasn't done. It was showing them where she was now, or where she would be soon, trapped in a place that looked like a corridor but felt like an invitation to step forward and never return. The disappearance of one of their own shattered whatever sense of control the investigation team still believed they had. Officer Daniel Hayes was not a rookie, not careless, not prone to fear. He had worked dozens of missing person cases and had learned how to detach himself from the worst of them. Yet in the final hours before he vanished, something in his demeanor shifted in a way his colleagues couldn't ignore. He grew quiet, distracted, frequently glancing over his shoulder as if listening for a voice no one else could hear. He brushed it off as exhaustion, but the dark circles under his eyes and the tremor in his hand told another story. That night, he volunteered for a routine patrol near the area where the woman had disappeared. No one questioned it until he failed to respond to radio calls 15 minutes later. Reviewing his bodycam footage became an exercise in dread. The early portion was uneventful, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the dark, the sigh of wind passing through trees. But even in those first minutes, an uneasy tension built. The audio began to pick up faint distortions, soft crackles that didn't belong to static, rhythmic pulses like a heartbeat, and distant murmurs that sounded almost like someone whispering his name. Hayes paused several times, turning his head as though trying to locate the source of a voice audible only to him. Each time, the camera caught his breath shuddering slightly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Halfway through the recording, he stopped walking entirely. The bodycam tilted as he lifted his head toward a narrow alleyway between two abandoned buildings. The camera captured nothing unusual at first, just a thick patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding night, but Hayes whispered something that made the investigators freeze. He said, "I hear her." His voice was calm, steady, almost relieved, as though he recognized the voice calling to him. He took a hesitant step toward the alley, then another, and the darkness seemed to swallow the edges of the flashlight's beam. The audio warped again, stretching and bending until it resembled a chorus of overlapping breaths. Hayes ventured deeper, the camera's brightness struggling to adapt as the shadows pressed in on all sides. Then, without warning, the beam flickered violently. In the final clear frame before the video deteriorated, a faint silhouette appeared at the far end of the alley, tall, thin, and unnervingly familiar in its stillness. Hayes exhaled sharply, as if recognizing it. The camera shook as he took one more step. The last seconds of footage were a blur of distortion. The alley darkened unnaturally, the audio surged into a low, vibrating hum, and Hayes whispered a soft, almost resigned, "I'm coming." Then the feed cut to black. Search teams arrived within minutes, but the alley was empty, the air unnervingly cold, and no trace of Officer Hayes was ever found. His disappearance made one thing painfully clear: Whatever had taken the others was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. It was watching them too, waiting for the moment they stepped close *enough to hear the voice it used to lead them into its waiting dark. Here is the full 450-word expansion of *** key point number 10 ** exactly as you requested, with no subheadings and no ending sentence. As the investigation reached its final stretch, a strange tension settled over everyone involved, as if the case itself resisted being solved. Detectives who had once eagerly pursued every lead now felt an inexplicable heaviness in their thoughts, as though every attempt to make sense of the evidence brought them closer to a truth they were never meant to uncover. Files went missing from locked cabinets, audio recordings distorted with static whenever the victim's name was mentioned, and even digital backups of case data would occasionally appear corrupted before restoring themselves without explanation. It was as if the case was alive and watching. The final breakthrough came not from new evidence but from a moment of sheer accident, when a junior officer discovered an unmarked envelope wedged behind a cabinet drawer. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and a map that pointed to a remote piece of forest land where the victim had reportedly been seen days before her disappearance. The team followed the coordinates, forcing their way through overgrown vegetation until they reached a clearing that none of them could recall existing on any map. The ground felt strangely cold despite the warm season, and the trees stood in a perfect circle around a patch of disturbed soil. In the center lay a single object, the victim's locket, polished as if freshly cleaned, though it had been missing for months. When detectives reached for it, the surrounding air shifted, a low vibration humming beneath their feet as if something massive and unseen stirred below the earth. The team attempted to dig, but every shovel of dirt seemed to return to place as soon as it was lifted, as though the ground rejected being disturbed. Photographs taken of the site appeared blank when viewed later, just empty white squares where the clearing should have been. Even more disturbing, every officer who entered the circle reported the same eerie sensation of being observed, not by a person but by a presence that lingered just beyond the edges of perception. They retrieved what they could, but it became clear that whatever happened there defied logic, and the victim's final moments were tied to something the human mind was never intended to comprehend. Back at the station, attempts to piece the new evidence into the existing timeline only fractured the narrative further, creating contradictions that made no sense. Time stamps didn't align, witness statements shifted, and even the officers' memories of the forest clearing differed wildly from one another. Some recalled glowing symbols etched into the soil, while others insisted the ground was smooth. A few swore they heard the victim's voice calling from beneath the earth, while others remembered only silence and the oppressive weight of the atmosphere closing in around them.